This we can trace back to the 18th century French artist Jean-Baptiste Greuze, who, following the very flamboyant Rococo period, very stylized period, he, as part of the French Enlightenment, was looking to bring naturalism into painting, and he went out into the streets to study real faces with real emotions that he then used into his paintings. Bring it fast forward, and we have John Baldessari, one of the leading early conceptual artists, who's performed a similar exercise in a number of his works from the 1970s, such as Violent Space Series, 5 vignetted portraits of stern situations, 1976, showing the expressive qualities of the human face in film. The thing is, he's isolated these faces from the film. We don't know what the context is or what the narrative is. And without that, it's really difficult to read exactly what these emotions are. I mean, they are extreme, but we can't tell. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they angry? Are they violent? We just know that they're extreme emotions. And this is one of the things that John Baldessari was involved with, is understanding how we comprehend emotion in imagery and particularly film. Here we have Bill Viola's film, which shows actors reacting to action occurring somewhere between themselves and the viewer. This leaves it to the viewer's imagination as to what we should be reacting to. For some reason. All right. And, okay, today we can easily signal emotion in our instant messages with an emoticon. And any teenager will tell you exactly what these images are. And I have to say, I just found this by accident the other day when I was emailing with Tracey Emin about the idea of emotion in art. And then I said, oh, what are these? And all these images came out. I said, oh, that's where they come from. But, you know, just look at this descendant right down from Greuze. Okay, now although we may feel reluctant to give in to our emotions standing in front of a Rothko, most of us do seem willing to be moved by the love stories and melodramas enacted on the movie screen. We become absorbed in the naturalism of film and its ability to develop believable emotional situations. And again, as Maurice Merleau-Ponty points out, the realism of movies demands that the actors express these emotions and gestures in a natural way in order to convince the audience of their sincerity. The least bit of stylization would destroy the illusion. We tend to empathize with the characters in films, recognizing in their faces and gestures the emotions we have felt. But this experience is generally that of the passive spectator. This explains why much contemporary work that deals with emotion is based on film, such as Cindy Sherman. We're seeing some of her early film stills here. Obviously, she did not make films. These are not from actual films. But she used the conventions of films to express in the kind of dread, the violence, love, desire, things that we're able to read in a film. She created in these photographs in which she plays all the protagonists. Now, one of the things that I'm finding interesting and really haven't seen anything written about except in the New York Times this Sunday, with the advent of Botox, which paralyzes the facial muscles. I was wondering whether we will still have that ability to read emotion in faces, especially in actors' faces, which, you know, their heads don't move anymore. And I find actually it's quite distracting watching films and television where no one can furrow their brow anymore. So ironically, when I was thinking about this last Sunday in the style section of New York Times, and I'm sure a number of you noticed this because it was an article about Miami's very own Dr. Fred Brandt, the pioneer of Botox, and he talked about this very subject, about how Botox has affected facial expression, but he also points out, but the eyes and the voice are still very good conveyors of emotion. Okay, and we go from the face itself to the mask. Artists such as James Ensor, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Rodin, Moreau, all symbolist painters, post-impressionist painters, reacted against the ills and alienation of the industrial age and instead sought to create work that reflected true sensations. They rejected the rational or irrational states of mind. They rejected the rational in favor of the irrational state of mind. They sought in their paintings to create the equivalent of received sensations, just using color and form. Ensor's famous painting, painted early in his career, of Christ's entry into Brussels, brings the world of Bosch into his times. And you could see in this huge parade scene that Christ is basically lost in a sea of grotesque masks, and raising the question, would anyone in modern times notice if Christ had emerged among us? Supposedly he associated with Christ at this time because he felt scorned by a public that didn't understand his work. Of course, he changed over time as he became more famous. My trip to Belgium actually was a great revelation. I went to Ensor's home in Austin, which is a seaside resort in Belgium, where he lived, and over his family's shop that sold masks. So the mystery of where all these masks came from that influenced him were right there, right under our nose. Ensor is also a major influence on Rita Ackerman. It was last year or the year before, MoMA in New York presented this amazing Ensor exhibition, and I know that Rita visited it at least 5 times. It's very important for artists to go look at art, and not just art of our time. They really need to know what other artists have done, how does it work, how does their work compare. It's their lifeblood, and that's where museums and galleries come, we're part of that education for artists. And you could see in this work that's in the show, another collaboration between Ackerman and filmmaker Harmony Korine, where she uses the film still from Korine's film Trash Humpers, where the figures are wearing these really creepy masks, how masks continue to be a way of conveying some kind of emotional effect. The art historian Robert Goldwater, who, by the way, if you don't know, was Louise Bourgeois' husband, he was also wrote the only article on Rothko that Rothko liked, wrote the first major study on primitivism and modern art, which was published in 1938. And he was particularly interested in the Fauves, who were the first to incorporate elements of primitivism in their work. Goldwater notes how primitivism functioned in these artists' work. For instance, the bathers in the landscape was a common theme in art history. The difference in a Fauve's scene of bathers is that, well, they're not really there to just take their clothes off and go bathing. They are just placed. They're in these. They're not serving any kind of action. Rather, they are, this is a quote from Goldwater, they are mixed up with the landscape in such a manner that they become part of it. And this is something that Rita Ackerman is also focused on, is the idea of how the figures become part of that landscape. The way the figures are cropped by the edge of the picture, particularly in this painting by Duran, indicates that they are not considered as set within the natural scene, but as being coexistent with it. There is no unified action. All the gestures are compelled by an interior mood of the figures. There doesn't seem to be any relationship between these figures. They all seem to be wandering in space. It's amazing they don't run into each other. And you could see, in Goldwater's next statement about the Duran bathers could just as easily describe one of my favorite paintings in the show, Ackerman's African Nurse. This is a quote from Goldwater. "The symbolic qualities are heightened by filling the frame by the figures, not by setting back into the picture, but any strip of foreground lacking perspective, depth, and psychological distance. They impose upon the spectator immediately without any intervention or artificial setting." Also, the way that the figures are cropped, and with Ackerman's work, it's almost as if the edges of the painting are squeezing her in as well as cropping her. She's almost like fighting against that edge. Again, a way of suggesting emotion. Here we have the same aim in Gauguin as Duran was to use form and color to suggest an interior world as opposed to reflecting the external world. He moved to Tahiti, as we know, as an escape from the modern world of the industrial age, seeking the real meaning of life in what he assumed was a world closer to the primitivism of Eden. Of course, he was in for a big surprise. He didn't quite find it, but he does suggest it in the paintings he sent home. The work by Gauguin does convey the anxiety and fear of the young girl who's being watched over by the spirit of the dead. And I do think that Ackerman does capture that same kind of anxiety and dread. Ackerman was especially impressed by Dubufay's art brut that returned to childhood states as a way of getting in touch with emotions. She also adapted his use of mixing sand into paint as a medium for its texture and for its metaphorical use. For Dubuffet, sand was, and this is a quote from him, "a fluid and tactile material that stretches out to infinity. It is a material without form. It is the only material in which the memory of time is not imprinted. In sand, the human trace is gradually erased and forgotten." Okay, and this is probably the granddaddy of symbolists. Wait, I have to see that. With the Edvard Munch Scream, which is probably the most cliched at this point of all, although obviously has a lot of power because everyone keeps seeming to steal different versions of it. The mask-like face emphasizes the scream of the mouth, the hands cupping the face. The scream itself seems to swirl throughout the landscape. And then there's these two ominous figures on the bridge that add to the anxiety. And we see the similarity to the Ackerman screaming, a firecrotch with the open mouth of the mask-like face, that also seems to be having a screaming orange aura surrounding it. The gun pointed at the viewer in the Ackerman is a direct violent affront to the viewer. And we see how violence is paired with fragility in this work. This is made obvious by the inclusion of a packing label with the glass icon at the bottom that is glued to the cardboard sandwich between the two sheets of plexiglass. You have this very violent image, but at the same time, her emphasizing the fragility of emotions, the fragility of the violence. And of course, Munch also was an important influence on many artists, including Tracey Emin, his famous kiss. We see it's not quite love, it's almost the two figures completely absorbing, suffocating each other, almost in a vampire-like gesture. And we see here Tracey Emin's Kiss of 2011, clearly based on the Munch composition. However, it was created for the front page of the British paper, The Independent, and it represents, can anyone guess what famous kiss of 2011 that the English papers would want on the front page? Yeah. There's still this quite not the same sinister overtones, but boy, Kate does have her eye open and looking right at us, thinking something is more than meets the eye here. Now, Tracey Emin was a very close friend of Louise Bourgeois, who died in 2010 at the age of 98. Emin feels that Bourgeois was particularly effective in reaching into her own emotions and conveying the states, these states to the viewer. I actually asked Tracey to name a few artists that she felt that really were able to do this, and she responded. She's been responding all week, giving me ideas, and she even asked if we were streaming this live because she wanted to watch it in London, but we are taping it, and it will be on our website, so she will get to see it. Now, Bourgeois developed several archetypes that connected with her own life and which had emotional impact for the viewer. The spider being one of the most recognizable of these repetitive images. And she did draw on her own life. And those of you who know, her childhood was had a lot of conflict. Whose doesn't? But she's, as an artist, was able to turn this into art and be able to share it with all of us so that we can be able to think about this and feel it as well. The spider represented her mother. Now, part of this was because the mother's family in Paris was a textile repair factory, atelier. So obviously the spider is a great representation of this idea of weaving, of creating the web through weaving. But it's also the idea of her mother being the kind of protectress of the family during this turbulent time. And so therefore the spider again becomes an important symbol for Bourgeois. However, I think that when it gets blown up to these proportions, not only do you have the sense of it protecting, but this ominous big giant spider, the legs form a kind of cage for the viewer. So it might be protecting, but protecting whom for what? Now, artists are really good at conveying anxiety, anger, violent emotions, loss, sadness, but conveying love, that's hard. We heard Tracey talking about it at the beginning. She does believe that there is love. She does believe that there is a real weight to this love, but how do you present it? Bourgeois, I think Bourgeois' couple is really a good example of what love feels like. It's hard to say this without sounding like I'm doing the dialogue from Jerry Maguire, but the sculpture shows how love can complete two isolated individuals. One can look at the way the figures embrace. The woman tenderly kisses the man's head, and it's a really lovely gesture where her tiptoes are on his feet. You could feel the love in this work, and without it feeling like they're strangling or absorbing, sucking each other dry, as in the Munch. This is true love. And now I thought it was very interesting that Emin also achieves this in her written works, which really do come from her heart, such as this recent neon with the phrase, "When I hold you, I hold your heart." And it does seem to be almost the written equivalent to the Bourgeois here. And she wrote this without sarcasm, without cynicism, without irony. It's a true sentiment written in her own hand, and I think, even though the fact that it's been translated into neon, we are seeing her own hand in this, which I think is important, and it's important to her. And with the light, the whole statement emanates, truly emanates emotion. Felix Gonzales Torres' work is a meditation on love and loss. The candy pile is actually the ideal weight of his lover, Ross, which would have been 175 pounds. He died of AIDS. Now, with this work and other works like it, Gonzales Torres is inviting the spectator to physically consume the candy in the pile. And taste the candy, put the candy in the mouth, taste it, and thereby by actually experiencing the sweetness of this love. Okay, so we've turned from being just pure passive spectators in most of art to actually now not only being told in an image, this is what love feels like, this is what love looks like, but you can actually experience it. This is what the sweetness of love. As the candy is removed, the weight diminishes, which parallels the weight loss of Ross prior to his death. Optimistically, the candy pile is constantly replenished, thereby restoring life, which basically is what art's about. It keeps, it's a way of transcending death. And we can see that AIDS is one of the reasons a lot of artists did begin dealing with the idea of emotion in their art in the 90s, late 80s and 90s. In 1997, we presented Zoe Leonard's installation called Strange Fruit for David, which consisted of the skins of fruit she and her friends had consumed over 5 years. She then mended the fruit by sewing or fastening their skins with thread, buttons, or zippers. She created the work to console herself over the death of her friend, artist David Bojanovich. I have trouble with that name, but I think a lot of you know who I'm talking about, who died of AIDS. It's truly in the tradition of the still life vanitas, the passing of life. But unlike a painting which freezes the state of the fruit forever, these fruit will continue to decay. And what's interesting is after we presented this exhibition, the Philadelphia Museum of all places acquired the work and knowing full well that it will eventually turn to dust, which was a very brave position for them to take. The other way of dealing with emotions that connect with us is to use nostalgia, the abject, the worn and torn, the loss, this discarded. All of this gives a sense of emotion. This work by Mike Kelley from 1987 is, I think, a particularly effective work. It's called More Love Hours That Can Ever Be Repaid. And what he did was he went to thrift stores and bought all those, those crocheted quilts and toys, dolls that grandmothers all over America make for their grandchildren. And at one point, the grandchild loved and slept, and that doll was everything. And yet, here they were, discarded in the thrift store. So not only is he dealing with this idea of loss, of the fact, but he's also dealing with guilt because the title is More Love Hours Than Ever Can Be Repaid. The idea of the nannies and the grandmothers patiently making these dolls, giving them in love to a child loving it, and then it's discarded. So nothing like guilt as an emotion. Although the individuals in here again, we have the idea of using something that suggests age in the past. Although individuals in the photographs of students in the Jewish high school in France, and that's what it's referred to, and it's altered to the Chase's high school prior to World War II, bear no connection to our own lives. We still have feelings of remorse that swell within us when we see this work and other works like it by Boltanski, because we see our fate prefigured in these forgotten faces. These works update again the Vanitas theme, reminding us of the transience of life. Transcendence, how to transcend the human condition. We are born alone, we suffer alone, we die alone, and we always are looking for achieving that ecstatic moment where we're able to transcend that very state. Okay, let's get happy. Okay. Representations of joy and the ecstatic, what more can be said? Matisse's Fauve masterpiece of the joy of life. Again, as in that early Duran, as we said, Fauve artists, as Goldwater pointed out, the figures are engaged in their own activities of the joy of life. Although there's like little groupings that seem to be connecting, as a whole, these figures are fairly isolated, having very little to do with each other, each in their own world. And as most of you know, Matisse did make separate paintings out of almost each one of these vignettes. And I love how Ackerman basically updated on the joy of life in her painting, Get a Job. All right, so she uses the same kind of, these bucolic bathers, in this case, East Village girls, all of whom are her. If you look at the face, it's the same face, and the face is of Rita. It's an early work of hers from 1993. But things aren't quite all happiness and joy. The title is Get a Job. And obviously, in the midst of all this joy and fun and partying, there is this anxiety that at least one of them had better go find a job to keep the party going. And if you look at the bottom left, there is also this sort of suggestion of blood, of violence, in that the artist has put her hands into red paint and sort of spread it across, sort of making an abstract expressionist painting.